Welcome to the Herland report, Mr. Helge Lurås. You are heading the Center for International and Strategic Analysis here in Norway. And we're talking about the Middle East, about Russia, about Syria, about the wars in the Middle East, also about immigration into Europe. We now are plagued with a number of terror incidents on European soil, and we see the tendency among Europeans to become very afraid of generalized all kinds of Muslims. And there's like a problematic situation. But what I find the most worrying, I would have to say, is that we seem to have a politicized media which tends to portray what's happening in the world according to some are good and some are bad. And this type of categorization, I find, doesn't reflect realism and doesn't reflect the plurality and the nuances in the world, and thus ends up creating more hatred between groups. Do you concur?
Our media is a reflection of the established paradigm in the West, which has settled in and which have proved successful up to a point. But I think now that with the changing world and when the consequences of our own ideas come into full view, so to speak, with open borders, with immigration, then that paradigm is not long anymore so credible. But the media is perhaps the mainstream media is perhaps the last entity to adjust to those new realities. And they cling to the old paradigm, hoping that the problems and the realities of the world will go away. But it won't. And that's also why we see an opposition against all established politicians, established media, from the populations both in the United States, in Europe, and other parts of the Western world.
And world-renowned linguist and activist, one has to say, Noam Chomsky has spoken about this on a number of occasions, the phenomenon that we have the tendency to manufacture consent, and the problem when the free press is no longer free in the West. When the press turns out to be a tool for political and economical elites, in furthering their message, then we don't have a free press anymore. I know you've spoken about Brexit. In regard to that, how do you view it problematic that the press seems to such a degree to be against the Brexit, but the British people voiced for it?
I think it's always been a sort of a utopian ideal to believe that you could have a completely free press, or a press that was its own entity, so to speak, the fourth estate that really were put in opposition to the other powers. It's always been part of the machinery of governance and the elite, but it has been perhaps in certain phases more independent, more free than it is now. I mean, we are coming in the West from a situation back in the decades where we had this division between the left and the right, between socialist ideas, capitalist ideas, and where you had press representing the various labor movements or the capital interest or the farmers' interest. That spectrum has narrowed over the last years, the last few decades, into one homogeneous soup of media controlled largely by the same established capital and political interests. So I think it is a reality that the spectrum in the media has diminished over the last few years, but we have never really had the ideal situation, and it's not surprising to me that we have had the situation, or that we have the situation we have. I think also we have to be aware that the media and many of the people who work in the media are not manipulators in their own mind. They are writing about and they are pressing forward views that they strongly believe. And the media we have now is also a reflection of the system of socialization that we have in the schools, and also overall in how we teach our kids and how we want them to behave as individuals. So what we see in the media is the result of deep cultural, historical trends in the West, but that they might be too utopian to actually meet the realities that we face in this globalized world where cultures meet, people meet, and the clashes that ensue from that process.
It seems to me that some of the same problem is occurring when referring to Russia these days, because in the Western media it seems that whatever goes wrong in the United States, whether it's domestic or whatever, it's always Russia's fault. And Russia seems to be demonized in a way that may be unbalanced. What's your view on this?
Yeah, I have that view. I don't see Russia to be the main threat towards the West or Western Europe, but it's made into that by a broad range in the establishment, from academic circles, researchers, to political figures, to the media itself. Of course, it has to do with historical aspects. There has for a long time been a tension between Russia and other powers in Europe. They do have their distinct history, their distinct culture, at the same time being very related to the rest of the West, perhaps even being, in some sense, part of the West. After the Second World War, it was a strong tendency in Europe to rid itself of its racist past, its colonial, imperialist past. And in that process, it became illegitimate to have as your enemy, or as the enemy of the West, anyone from other religions or other ethnic backgrounds, call it races. But it's very difficult for any group of humans to exist without anyone to be defined against. Our identity is a definition of ourselves in relation to someone else. And those others will easily become, in a sense, enemies, or be portrayed as enemies. And Russia has been, of course, during the ideological conflict between communism and capitalism, was a clearly defined and perhaps even credible threat to the system in Western Europe. When the Cold War ended, Russia was a very different being. It was not really a threat. But then the West was sort of left without any enemy. And the enemy that rose its head, radical Islam, was also from a different culture, different looking people. Difficult for the West to portray Islam as an enemy, as a threat, without compromising on the cleansing that happened after the Second World War. But with Russia, it's different. They are white people, they are Christians. So it's easier in the Western context to have them as your enemy and to demonize them, and that has definitely happened. I think the second point is that many in Europe and in the United States see in the more authoritarian, nationally conscious model in Russia as perhaps something we are moving towards. We are becoming in the West more like Russia, rather than Russia becoming like us. And that plays a very psychological game in our mind, which I think increases the tensions that Westerners would like to portray, or at least the established media would like to portray of Russia.
It's a paradox. The Russian people, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, obviously, and the fall of the Soviet Union, it's a paradox that post-Yeltsin, with all the chaos that was in Russia at that time, upon the entry of Vladimir Putin as Russian leader, we see a clear-cut return to the historical roots of the Russian identity, and this being used as a tool in order to restructure the Russian identity. This vastly large and pluralistic country of 140 million people across such a vast physical area as well, we know was an atheist state under Soviet Union, and now there's such a resurge of the Christian values and the Orthodox values. Maybe is Russia to a degree going in opposite directions from the West, in the sense that Russia coming back to its historical roots and its traditional values, but in the West we see the opposite direction. We're trying to move, or at least the elites are trying to move starkly in an anti-Christian kind of manner. When you look at Hollywood and the films being spewed out of Hollywood, it's appalling to see a number of the values and the hedonist and nihilist views coming out of this. How do you see that?
I think you're right, at least if we take the description up until recently, that Russia and the West have moved in different directions, that Russia has gone more traditional, more back to its roots, while the West have tried to, in a sense, erase our roots. But over the last few years, it seems to me that there are changes happening in the West, and that there are significant now segments of the population in the West who would like to go back more to our roots, to the historical, cultural, even religious roots of our civilization, and to resurrect at least part of them. And that means that the West and Russia might close the gap between them in terms of the historical trajectory. And that this phenomenon of going back to your roots, being conscious of your identity, is something that the established media and the establishment overall is also against. But I think they are seeing now that they are losing their hegemonic grounds on it, at least, that there are significant opposing forces that we saw in 2016 with Brexit, and also the election of Donald Trump, and also the rise of what is called far-right or populist parties in many Western European countries as well, which is this nativism or the wish to get your identity back, I would say. And in order to get your identity back, what is natural is actually to go back to your historical cultural roots.
It's a paradox. Sometimes I think of it as a return to the French Revolution, though not as dramatic, but in a sense it is the people, the European peoples, rising up against what they perceive to be an elite, which doesn't represent them anymore. And this is deeply problematic, and one of the reasons why both you and I predicted both Brexit and Donald Trump. Not that Donald Trump is the most competent or perfect leader in the United States, but it's a natural choice. At least he was not part of the George Soros group and participating in the same type of agenda. We saw Hillary Clinton actively pushing for wars in the Middle East, Libya war and all that. And people don't want it. I mean, you know, when you look at polls from the United States, 74% of the American people say they do not want any more wars in the Middle East. Why are we there? And still one sees that this elite keeps bringing on problems, which now obviously also is creating much of what we see in Europe as very problematic, the millions of refugees flooding in. Another issue which I find very interesting is also that in Europe, over 80% of the European people say they believe in Jesus Christ as the Son of God. You have the whole Catholic belt south, you have the whole Protestant Germany. I mean, broadly speaking, the media elites and much of the political elites in Europe are on a collision course against their own people. Maybe this is why so many conservatives now in Europe start to look to Russia and kind of like some of...
Yeah, I mean, I think it's true that there is a growing gap between the elite and the people. But at the same time, I think this will be a rather slow and tumultuous process, because the people is not one group here. I mean, there are significant numbers of people, ordinary people, who still comply with the established line. And to move away from it is a very fraught psychological process, because it's not only in the media that this narrative are dominant. It's dominant in the school system. So from we are very small, we are being told this narrative and this presentation of what they believe is the reality. The way forward, I think, is going to be a very polarized, for a moment, political process. It could rupture the whole fabric of Western society because the values ingrained in the established position has also deep historical roots. I think roots going back to at least Christianity. And my hope, at least, I wouldn't say it's an expectation, but my hope is that we will be able in the West to have a dialogue going forward which is inclusive between those that now oppose the established view and the establishment itself.
And it's interesting to see how in Scandinavia, for example, you see so many voices now. I live in the Middle East, and many say there that we thought none of you Westerners were against that kind of structure. But we now see in the Scandinavian countries, and with my Herland report as well, I mean, there's an immense interest, and there's so many interesting voices in a country like Norway, Sweden and Denmark that actually so agree with the need to have a new paradigm that better can, reflect the realism we see in the world. And for example, looking at the sanctions against Russia, for example, it's also a paradox. Is the U.S. pushing for sanctions against Russia? U.S. now is in deep economic trouble, over 20 trillion in debt, and it's not an easy situation if more and more nations start to move away from the dollar, the use of the dollar as a currency, for example, which now is happening in China and Russia and also in South America, and the BRIC countries establishing their own banks and all this to get away from the control of the IMF and everything. But I'm wondering, why doesn't Europe have a more independent role? Because much of the Russian sanctions is really, it's creating problems for us. It's creating problems for Germany, for Norway, for Finland, for many of them, because Russia is our neighboring country.
Well, I mean, we haven't in Europe been able to look at our interests separate from the United States. It's sort of a leftover from the Cold War. There has never been sort of a real strategic review in the Western European establishment. It's just been taken for granted that this alliance across the Atlantic needs to continue, and that has been dictated on American terms. I believe that the West should stick together as a civilizational unit, and that includes the United States. But there needs to be a realistic voicing of specific Western European concerns in that regard. There are differences based on geography and history between Europe and the United States, not least that is showing itself in the Middle East. The fate of the Middle East and Europe is much more tied together than between the Middle East and the United States. If I could, on the terms of how this awakening, you might call it, on part of people in Europe and the United States relate. I think there is a lot of hidden support for the alternative view. There are many people who see that the narrative being presented is wrong, is unrealistic, but it's also being tied to, in a sense, what we perceive as immorality. Nationalism is like immorality to us after the Second World War, so that people do not dare to voice their opinions, even to, I think, their very closest friends or even their spouses. But they do hold them, and that is this prison that political correctness have made us into living in, and which hampers our ability not only to speak, but our ability to discuss and even to think.
This is very strange, because when you look at the UN, was founded on the principle of the respect for national sovereignty. I mean, there's so many nations in the world. Each nation has to be able to rule on its own territory and decide which rules and regulations, cultural values, religion is going to preside in their region or within their culture and country. And this was also precisely the point in the Westphalia Peace that created peace in Europe in the 1600s, in which after there had been so many wars in Europe, the decision that England is to be able to decide which rules, regulations, which law systems they want, and France the same. And thus you created the nation state. So even though we had the destructive National Socialism, and please remember it was socialism in Germany during World War, still the concept of the nation state and the nation state being the item that actually created peace and reorganized the structure between the nations goes back to the Westphalia Peace and was really what helped Europe end its wars. So in that sense, I find it strange also that it's such a demonized to speak about the nation state, although it was precisely the nation state that created peace in Europe at that time.
I mean, it's true that the nation state created peace, but of course the nation state was created through a process of bloodshed in many cases as well, which those that are nationalists are, point out as often as they can. But in addition to that, of course, we had the two world wars, which were also products of nationalists' ambitions and sentiments, and then especially after the Second World War, when the cleansing of the Nazi past, which also was a sort of an extreme version of nationalism as well, made that over time, because the UN Charter was created more than 70 years ago. At that time they still had in mind that the nation state had some good sides. But over these 70 years there has happened things in Western culture and Western academia where, in my opinion, they have gone in a too far in an idealistic direction and lost sight of the reality and the reality of human nature and how we function in social processes. And I think that this experiment, which is really going on now, of getting rid of the nation state without having any credible alternative for what should be in its place, is a very harmful, potentially disastrous effect for the West, and I would say perhaps even for areas outside of the West as well. I think we need to get realism back into Western politics and Western discourse and into Western media.
Some of the problems with globalization we've also seen in the interference and interventions in Middle Eastern countries such as Iraq and Syria and Libya by Western forces as well, participating in a geopolitical struggle that really is a geopolitical struggle that concerns the people in that particular region between Saudi Arabia, let's say, and let's pick Iran then. So we see again that the meddling into each other's business too much ends up creating large problems and also a lot of terrorism on European soil.
I mean, it's true. I mean, of course, I mean, a lot of the turbulence that we see now would not have been there or been in different form if the West hadn't intervened militarily and strategically in those areas. But I think a large part of that intervention have been done based on good intentions, bad analysis and bad judgments, but basically good intentions, and this belief that we can transform these other societies, that ultimately they are really just other versions of ourselves, that culture and history doesn't matter really, that everyone would like to be liberal, democratic if they just are given the opportunity to put a ballot in a box. And this naive analysis and grounds for evaluation that we have in the West have brought disasters, because societies are based on and a product of their own culture and their own history, and in that sense we have brought problems on others. But I think that even without our intervention there would have been problems in the Middle East and in other parts of the world of reconciling their own historical many times backward cultural practices to the realities of a technologically modern and globalized interconnected world. So I think, as we see now, a lot of the bloodshed going on in the Middle East is groups in the Middle East fighting each other. There are old disputes among neighbors, sects, ethnic groups, and those fallouts, I think, eventually would have come in some form, even without our military intervention. So I think we shouldn't blame ourselves for everything, and we shouldn't let others blame ourselves in the West for every disaster that happens in the world.
Helge Lurås, thank you very much for coming and speaking to us. You are the head of the think tank Center for International Strategic Analysis. Good luck in your work. Hope to have you here at the Herland Report at a later occasion. Thank you.
Thank you so much.